Inequality is on the rise. There's been a increase in far right-wing and far left-wing politics, and less people in the centre. This is due to a number of factors: inequality, cost of living going up and house prices going up. Wages have remained stagnant for years. And a book I've been reading recently from 2010 talks a lot about the issues that we face today. That book is 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism by Ha-Joon Chang. So as I mentioned, it was written in 2010, just after the financial crisis of 2008. It goes through multiple different arguments on why neoliberalism and the free market are bad, why we need financial regulation, and why we should return to a manufacturing economy. So let's get right into it. The first chapter, it starts off strong, and it talks about why the free market is a lie. So this chapter talks about things such as child labour, slavery and drugs, and how all these things are illegal, and yet this directly contradicts free market ideology. One of the examples it gives is about in the 19th century when they were banning child labour. There were two camps, two arguments. On one side were people saying we need to get rid of this, children are getting injured, they don't really know what they're getting themselves into, they can't accept these contracts because they're too young. But then on the other side, people were saying, well, no, come on, hold on. Both of these individuals are entering into a private contract. Why should the government be able to interfere with that? The children wants work and money. The employer wants a worker. What's the issue? They're both benefiting from this. Now, obviously, we look back and know all the things that are wrong with child labour and how exploitative it is. But back then, that was a real debate over the free market, essentially. And it makes you think, how many things today will be seen as abhorrent and wrong, exploitative, in 100 years' time that we won't get rid of because of the free market. You know, this is things like 0-hour contracts and poverty wages and the minimum amount of holidays that you get in a year. As I previously mentioned, this book goes into a lot of detail on why free market economics is bad and the failures of neoliberalism. One of the things it talks about is how in the post-war period there was a sort of consensus that the government's role was to keep employment high, to give people jobs so that they could survive and live. However, since the late 70s with the neoliberalism ideology, there's been a shift in what the perceived role of the government is, and now it's all about growth, it's about keeping inflation low, keeping growth high, making the economy as good as possible, and all these things are being put in front of people. However, this obsession with keeping inflation low has actually made growth worse and made people's lives worse. Another thing it talks about in line with this is how neoliberalism says that things like tariffs, subsidies and investment are bad and are against free market. We should be letting the market decide where the money goes and not trying to prop up industries that aren't profitable. And yet, when you look through history, all the rich countries used protectionism and had subsidies and all these things in place while they were getting rich and was the reason they got rich. And all the poor countries have been excluded from this system. When you look at countries like Africa, in the post-war period, they grew at a respectable rate, 3%, 5%, etc. But since then, they've grown at 0.1%, 0.2% because they've had free market capitalism imposed on them by things like the World Bank and the IMF. These protectionist policies allow for national companies to grow and be shielded from external competition, which is really important for a country with little industry. Right now, what happens in these third world countries is that a foreign company will come in, take all the resources, take the manufacturing to another country, and all of the high-paying, high-value jobs are done in the home country, while all of the resource extraction and the manual labour jobs are kept in the poor country. Essentially, free trade is just another vehicle for neocolonialism and exploitation. If we adopted more protectionist policies, this would encourage growth in companies ran in the country that the protectionist policies were placed in. Let's take Britain, for example. Since neoliberalism, a lot of companies that were run in the UK and owned by UK businesses and have been bought by foreign entities, such as Bentley being bought by Volkswagen and Cadbury's owned by Mondelez International. The book goes into detail about how foreign companies and foreign ownership ruins the domestic industries. National companies have a moral obligation to the country that they're in. They tend to pay higher wages, they tend to have more moral work practices, and they'll keep the highest value jobs in their own company. Even international companies, where their base of operations is usually where the decisions are made, where the highest paid employees are, and generally gets the most benefits. The caveat to this is private equity firms, where a company will just buy up loads of different companies, extract all the wealth that they can, and then sell them on. This is not good, and it's probably better to be owned by a foreign company at that rate. But industry takeovers can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. The book is sort of uncertain on this aspect. It's used to defeat competition, and sometimes it's used to upgrade and combine technologies from two different rivals. Finally, the book goes into detail on how the government can pick winners. Government investment is really important and is one of the reasons why the US is so big. It invests so much into technology, whereas other countries don't do this as much. China is also a country that does this a lot. They have a lot of protectionist policies such as tariffs and subsidies, but they also own a lot of companies, large stakes in a lot of national companies. This means that they have a say in the operations of those companies and can also finance them. This stops foreign competition with their up-and-coming industries while protecting the bigger industries as well. And it doesn't stop capitalism from working. They still have a lot of competition inside the country between these different companies. But at the end of the day, all of these companies are in China, so they're all making money for China. And the foreign companies are at a disadvantage because they're not getting that support. Another thing the book talks about is how regulation can be a good thing. So one of the arguments that is given against regulation is how the government doesn't know what they're doing, they shouldn't be getting involved in the processes of companies. Obviously, the biggest example of this is the USSR, where that system failed, which was a completely centrally planned government. However, we still live in planned economies. There's this myth that there's absolutely no planning by government, which just completely isn't true. We have things like indicative planning, and a lot of R&D, as I know, is supported from the government, which steers the direction of which companies get investment, which don't, which get big, which fail. And also, corporations are centrally planned. It's the exact same thing, it's just on a smaller scale. Some of the reasons it gives for regulation being a good thing is that it stops short-term thinking. If all companies are allowed to think short-term and put short-term profit against long-term profit, there becomes an incentive to put short-term profit over long-term profit. As if you think your competitor's going to be doing this, then you need to do it, because if you start putting long-term profit over short-term profit, they're going to outcompete you in the short term and you may go bankrupt, even though you're doing the better thing and the more sustainable thing. However, if regulations are put in place to stop this short-term thinking, it benefits all companies, because then all companies are forced to work well in the long run and to have sustainable business practices. Another thing it talks about is the argument that, well, the government doesn't know what they're doing, so why should they be able to decide regulation? The argument it gives against this is that nobody knows what they're doing, which has been demonstrated perfectly by the 2008 financial crisis. We were told everything's fine, you know what they're doing, and yet it all collapsed because there's such complex financial instruments nowadays that nobody knows the full implication, and so these should be banned and regulated until we understand exactly how these things work. Another really important thing the book talks about is how manufacturing is better than services. Manufacturing can grow quicker because efficiencies made in manufacturing are real efficiencies. If you can make a car twice as fast, you can sell twice as many, you make twice as much products. However, if you increase the productivity of a service, that usually means either making the quality worse or doing less of the service. For example, if you have an orchestra and they can perform a symphony in an hour, making them perform the symphony in half an hour doesn't make the symphony better. It's either just twice as fast, which ruins the symphony, or they're cutting out half of the symphony. And you can see this in the modern day. Countries that have high manufacturing have high qualities of life. If you compare countries like Britain to Europe, where Britain has a very high service industry with falling wages and a cost of living crisis, whereas Europe have better quality of life and higher wages, this is due to their high manufacturing sector. Another point which was mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, is that office workers are much less likely to unionise, especially nowadays when everybody's working from home. It's a lot harder to communicate with your fellow workers, and a divided as a group easily conquered. If you're working in manufacturing and you're next to the people you work with all day, you can say, hold on a minute, this isn't right, we need to do something about this. And you can unionise, collectivise, and make your situation better for all of you. But if you're working by yourself, it's a lot harder to do that. And that is another thing that this neoliberalist free market sort of ideology has put on us, is it destroyed the unions that helped get all of the things that we take for granted now in place. You know, lots of holidays, shorter work days, better working conditions, higher pay. Finally, the book talks about how we need to trust workers more and trust CEOs less. In a lot of Japanese companies, there's a policy where if a worker puts an idea forward, it is genuinely considered as they are somebody on the ground with knowledge of the work they're doing, whereas CEOs and managers might not have that in-depth knowledge. This is something that's missing from our society, where CEOs are seen as people of importance, as people who know exactly what they're doing, and workers are just seen as somebody who uses their labour to get money. However, this is not necessarily the case. CEOs aren't always paid in according to the work that they do and the benefit that they give to the company, whereas workers tend to be underpaid. Things like dividends and share buybacks incentivise short-term profit taking rather than long-term stability, whereas companies that are run collectively by the workers, such as co-ops, tend to be a lot more long-term orientated and work a lot better, such as Dragon in Spain. Finally, a thing that neoliberalism and the new right talk about is the welfare state, and how a high welfare state discourages people from working because they have something to fall back on. And while this is an interesting argument, and I think there's definitely some merit to that, the converse argument of this is that having a high welfare state allows people to take more risks. It allows people to open up that business. It allows people to go back into education because they know they've got that welfare to support them if things don't work out. And that encourages economic growth. It also encourages people to pursue things that they really want to do, rather than staying in jobs because they're worried about what would happen if they don't have that job, which increases productivity. So the neoliberalist view also looks at people in the worst light. It takes them as selfish and lazy rather than hardworking, which the book talks about. If you treat people as selfish and lazy, then they will be selfish and lazy. But if we set up a system that allows people to be ambitious, that allows people to work hard, then they will work hard and they will do that. The system that we're currently living in only uses money as an incentive when humans have so many more incentives. The problem with communism and the problem with the Soviet Union is that they didn't use money enough to motivate people. Money is a good motivator, and we still need that in society, and I think that's why capitalism works so well. But it's not the only motivator, and when it is treated as the only motivator, high inequality is the outcome it takes. It definitely has made me think about the world that we live in and the system that we're living in currently in a different light. It showed me that the world hasn't always been the way that it is, and the world hasn't necessarily gotten better in a straight line. There's been ups and downs. In conclusion, this book is really good. It's expanded my knowledge on economics and capitalism. It's definitely taught me a lot of things. It's helped me understand topics that I didn't understand before. I think I already agreed with a lot of the things that this book talks about before I read the book. I watched channels such as Gary's Economics and Jimmy the Giant, so I didn't really like neoliberalism to start with, but it was still quite interesting to read this. And there's also some points in here that I don't agree with. He has some takes on immigration that I don't agree with, and some other things. But all in all, it's a really good book. I definitely recommend it, and the conclusions that it comes to are quite interesting. So, what are the conclusions that I've taken from this book? Capitalism is the worst economic system, except for all the others. Capitalism works. It's given us the world that we're in today with computers and cars and high standards of living in the West, but it has major flaws, and when concentrations of wealth and power are allowed to happen, the fundamentals of capitalism actually break down. Regulation and wealth distribution, I believe, actually help enforce capitalism or increase the competition that capitalism provides. If poorer people have more money, they can spend more, which increases the opportunity for businesses and the amount of revenue that they can make. If people have more money, they can open small businesses. If people have more access to welfare, they can take those risks to open small businesses, which increases competition and innovation, which is what capitalism is all about. When very large companies are allowed to have monopolies over whole industries, it kills innovation and it kills competition. We need to build our new economic model on the understanding that we don't understand things fully. The world is very complicated nowadays, especially financial systems, and even economists don't understand them fully. We need to thoroughly investigate complex financial instruments and use them to the best of our ability and ban them where possible. We need to dispel the myth that people are always paid what they're worth. CEOs that have hundreds of millions of pounds in revenue and bonuses every year aren't worth any more than the McDonald's worker or the bin man. They don't work any harder and they don't necessarily deserve that much money. Wealth needs to be redistributed. We need to forget this idea that we live in a post-industrial society. Things are still important, people still buy things, and the service industry doesn't grow as quickly as the manufacturing industry. We need a bigger government, we need better regulations, and we need more involvement by the government to help small businesses grow, to help industries that aren't currently thriving in this country and in others. And we need that referee to stop massive companies and high net worth individuals from controlling masses. And finally, I believe we should build this new system to bring out the best in people rather than expecting the worst. Money is a powerful motive, as people well know. Money makes the world go round, but it's not the only motive, and when you make it so, it encourages selfishness and discourages moral behaviour, community and compassion. So that's what I got from this book. I really recommend it if you want to grab it. And yeah, do all the YouTube things, subscribe, like, comment, that sort of stuff. Thank you.